funny story. When first started talking about this, it was over the winter and it was pretty cold, and Michael and I spoke, and I said, yeah, I'd love to start this off again, but I said, can you have it in a nice warm place? You know, nice resort. He said, absolutely. And I said, can you make sure that I don't follow Kim Lear on the agenda? Crucial. I know her, I know she's fantastic, and I knew that that would be a tough act to follow, but hopefully we'll do it justice. I wanted to start quickly by just going over our agenda. Whoops. Michael kind of teed this up, but we work at hundreds of institutions every year. As a result, we see a lot of the conversations and the trends that happen out there. So what I want to do today is highlight 5 of the trends that we think are going to be impacting your lives in the years that come, and allow our panel, who are in the trenches every day, talk about their experiences at their institution. And as we go, I want to invite you to interrupt, ask us questions, engage. And with us, we have this nice throwable catchbox microphone that will be thrown around the room. So if you raise your hand, I'll be happy to whiz this your way and go from there. You can throw it really hard if you don't like the guy across the room. Wing it. Want to start by allowing our panel to introduce themselves really quickly.
Mike McCabe, Vice President of Facilities, Princeton University.
Jim James, Vice Chancellor for Facilities and Real Estate, University System of Georgia.
I'm Kim Kiernan, the Administrative Director at the University of Michigan.
And I'm Mike Berthelsen, the Associate VP for Facilities on the Twin Cities campus in Minnesota.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to frame this out by talking about why we do what we do at Sightlines. And we started this company about 15 years ago. And the idea came out of eCubo conference in 2000. And we had a bunch of business officers and facilities folks in the room. And we asked the business officers something. We said, how many of you in here know the value of your endowment? And everybody raises their hand. We say, how many people in here know the draw rate on your endowment, return on your endowment? And all the hands were up. And then we said, how many people in here can answer those same questions about your facilities? How many people know your replacement value off the top of your head? About half the hands went down. Then we said, how many people know your deferral rate, your reinvestment rate, your backlog? And when we asked those questions, almost all the hands went down. And what we realized was that there are simply not the same tools in place at most institutions to measure facilities with the same rigor that you measure finances. The interesting thing is that when you look at the value of those things across institutions, at most schools across the country, facilities is worth 4 to 5 times that of financial assets. So when I talk to groups like this, I'm not talking to people that are responsible for construction projects and custodial and grounds and maintenance. I'm talking to the largest asset managers at these institutions. Yet, you're not empowered with the same tools. And so what we tried to do was to create a model that we call return on physical assets, or ROPA Plus for short, that involves a discovery process and then tools that help you basically measure, monitor, and benchmark a facility's performance every year. The way we do that is by driving a new conversation at institutions. We try to bring together things that are oftentimes handled in different places at the school. And you can't really have an effective conversation about facilities and long-term strategy without bringing together concepts of space, capital, and operations. And that's exactly what we do every year. Being able to do that, it gives us access to data at hundreds of institutions across the country. We're proud to work in 41 states as of yesterday, at about 350 ROPA members and 450 colleges and universities across the country. A lot of you are here today, and of course, we thank you for your continued support over the years. The information that I'm going to be going through today and teeing up for the panel here is based upon our annual report. So we compile a lot of the information that we collect in an annual report called the 2015 State of Facilities in Higher Education. It outlines some of the most important trends and benchmarks that we see every year. And what I want to do now is just talk about 5 of them that we think are really important conversations that we see happening out there right now. I want to start with space utilization. At the conference last year, one of the topics that we heard discussed most was space and how we use it. And this is an interesting time within college campuses because even though we're all under continual pressure to add space, add classrooms, add residence halls, the numbers don't always say that that's oftentimes needed. And this is when you look nationally. For the first time at our member institutions, space growth has surpassed enrollment. And we actually have a decline in many states across the country that's driving down this national average. As an industry, according to our 450 members, we are building space faster than we are bringing students onto campus. That is not the story everywhere. In fact, one of the most important distinctions is by institution type. And this might be pretty small, but when we look at research institutions, both public and private, there is no lack of student body. In fact, students are growing far faster than space has been for the last 8 years. Not the case at comprehensive institutions, and absolutely not the case at smaller institutions. Enrollment has taken a hit, and space has not stopped, except recently at smaller institutions, the growth has begun to slow down. And what's interesting is that what we're starting to hear, particularly at those smaller schools, the pressure is still there to build. The question is not how much space do we need, it's are we getting the most from the assets that we currently have. When we look just at classroom space across the country, we typically see that about 55 to 60% of a classroom is occupied for 55 to 60% of the available hours every day, and that's based upon a typical 9 to 5 day, which is not often the typical academic day, but we're going to pretend that it is. And that has real value in terms of dollars, and we like to tie everything back to cash. And here's an analysis that we did for one school that was just looking at a subset of their space, about 47,000 square feet. When you looked at the cost of capital, the cost of operations, the cost of annual stewardship, they were actually not utilizing $25 million worth of teaching space at the campus just because they were only using this space for 50% of the time. Every additional point of increased utilization put $560,000 of asset back into use. So with space utilization being our first topic, I'd like to open up to the panel and basically ask them, are there any of you that are doing anything unique, or have you taken a real critical look at space use over the last few years?
I'll start if it's okay. The University System of Georgia, about 4 years ago, did a comprehensive space utilization study, primarily focusing on classrooms and offices. And it was about a year-long study, very comprehensive, and resulted in some data that's been used very effectively since then. Even the state legislature now wants to see the utilization rates at a campus before they want to authorize a new classroom building. And different legislators will even argue my campus needs it more than yours, because if you look at the data, they need the space. So we've actually had projects canceled because of that. A lot of the universities themselves or colleges did not know themselves how much their facilities are being used. And actually several large projects were canceled by the campus themselves because they realized they didn't need it. It's a very complex question because some classrooms are highly specialized. For example, teaching nursing students, clinical labs. Those can only be used for your cohort of nursing students, and so therefore your utilization rate may only be 10 or 15 hours per week. Whereas a general classroom, you could theoretically have classes from 7 in the morning until late at night. But it has had a big impact at the University System of Georgia. We have 29 institutions across the state, and it's been a very effective tool that we've used on project planning.
Thank you.
I'd just add to what Jim said. We just started a new campus planning process about a year ago, and one of the first things we did was a space utilization study. And we intuitively knew, because we have a relatively small campus, where we had inefficiencies. But this allowed us to quantify a lot of it. And our biggest savings will be in classroom space. I'd love to think we had 60% use of classroom space. We don't have anywhere near that. And part of the reason is because of culture. At Princeton, the faculty don't like classes before 10 o'clock in the morning, and the students don't like classes on Friday. So that really creates a challenge when you're trying to use a smaller amount of classroom space more efficiently. And so at this point in time, we've given the administration information that they can use to challenge that culture, and we'll see what happens.
That's interesting that you say that about the culture, Mike, because at Michigan we did a similar effort with space utilization, and we took 2 things from it to try to help change the culture. One was shared classrooms across different schools and colleges. That was a huge effort. So getting deans to actually share space is always fun, but we also used the data as part of whenever the academic units are requesting additional capital, they have to justify why their classroom utilization numbers may or may not be hitting specific benchmarks. It's been very helpful.
Minnesota, I think we've probably about 15, 18 years ago, created an office of classroom management just to manage this issue. And so I think in classrooms, we've made great progress. And it's really highly used. About 80% of the classrooms are centrally scheduled, and only 20% are departmental. Most of those are quite small sort of sections. But they're only 4% of our space. So when our regents asked, what about classrooms? They asked about utilization. I say it's the best managed space on campus. It's offices where we have a problem. We have 25% of our space is offices, and we don't have any metric or means to tell how it's used other than walking around. And you can have we have this sort of odd thing where I think maybe other people see this too, the people who are in their offices or their cubes, because their job demands it all the time, have the smallest spaces. The faculty or administration who is not in their offices very much at all have the biggest ones. So effectively we have this enormous distributed personal library collection storage mechanism called offices. And that's our biggest hurdle. And so we don't have everyone knows it. Right now we're starting to see pilot projects. We built a new clinic building. Doesn't have any offices. It just has touchdown spaces for faculty or others who are going to be there. Our Office of Human Resources created the first kind of 2 floors of open landscape, no offices, quiet zones, kind of thing that you're starting to see across the country. So we're seeing it in pockets, but we don't have a systematic way to go at it yet.
That's interesting. Let me ask a question based upon what we heard last night, which is Kim Lear spoke about how different generations work differently. As a new generation of faculty comes in, are you seeing their preferences for office space change in any way? Are you seeing the appetite for more hoteling space or more common areas affect the way that you would allocate space when you were adding a new building?
I don't think we've seen them ask for it differently, but we watch it with our student employees come in. They're troubled by living in this box, and then we teach them how to like it and have their own space. So it's kind of we're creating this. We create the demand, and also I think we just don't provide opportunities or options for faculty because it's hard to turn it that quickly. The assumption is that the next generation doesn't really want it. They would rather have a Starbucks and a place to sit. And so if we could create one of those in every building, maybe we'd be okay and could get rid of the offices, but I don't really know.
Great, thank you. Any questions about space utilization from the audience? While we're on?
So we've, as we've done energy recommissioning and started to put in monitors for turning off lights automatically, we tied that back to a server, and now we can, for the places we've done that, we can give actual hours. We can't tell how many people, so unlike classroom management, they can tell me exactly how many seats are filled. We only know that somebody was there. But we're just starting to quietly gather that on our own, and some for labs, some for those kind of conference rooms.
Great, thank you. I'm going to jump ahead, topic of technical complexity. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's an important topic, and it's something that we see really affects operations on a day-to-day basis at a lot of institutions. And that is, as we add new spaces, particularly on smaller campuses, we oftentimes see that those spaces are more and more technically complex compared to existing facilities on campus. And what we do at all of our schools is have a very simple 1 to 5 ranking scale for complexity, of 5 being a animal care type healthcare space, a 1 being a standalone small house. And what we tend to see is that across the industry, we're constructing a lot of 4s and 5s. Everything is air conditioned in most regions of the country. Everything has air movement, complex controls, etc. Well, and what does this mean? It means that daily service is typically now more expensive. Work orders done in more highly complex spaces simply cost more money. Energy actually goes up, and it's not that they're inefficient buildings, because they are oftentimes very efficient. But when you're adding a high-tech science laboratory to a campus that has traditionally been non-air-conditioned, steam-driven buildings, you're going to use more energy in that new laboratory facility. But the other thing that we see people, I won't say struggling with, but a challenge that they have is that they oftentimes construct these new buildings and don't have the skill set in the workforce in place to run and maintain them. And so it really causes a critical shift in staffing, and really has to make you rethink oftentimes how you run your department. So I wanted to mention this because it's absolutely a trend that we see. And if anybody on the panel has anything that they'd like to offer on that, love to hear it. Otherwise, we can move on to the next highly charged topic.
I'm old enough to remember when we went from pneumatic controls to DDC, electronic controls, and one of the best career paths for a young person who wants to be involved in building operation is management of those electronic controls. The University of Alabama at Birmingham, where I was there for 25 years, there were just 2 people in the entire maintenance staff who could make those digital controls work. And these guys were all commanding 6-figure salaries, high 6-figure salaries. So it's a tremendous opportunity for somebody who wants to do that. And it's not your typical screwdrivers. You know, these guys are sitting at a laptop tied into the system, adjusting the airflows and whatnot. So it is a big challenge to find people who can actually operate those systems.
It will continue to have a shift to decrease the number of construction trades and increase the number of engineers. We're on that long pattern of doing it. But we find things, our energy folks will find things that where maybe a trade didn't know how to fix it, so they shoved the 2x4 in the actuator. You know, they're going to shove something in there, make it work the hard way, but it breaks apart. So you have this, it is a big shift for our workforce and what that means.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that where the maintenance staff would dumb down the system. You know, it may have been the engineers a VAV system, but in order to make it work and get the faculty happy, they basically turned it into a constant volume system. And so the energy savings were lost. You have to recommission these buildings about every 5 years just to get them back to where they were originally designed.
I think our challenge too has been not only with the maintenance but with the custodial, because we're getting a lot of requests for specialized or very high-end finishes that aren't really the typical for our custodial group. So we're doing different service levels in different types of buildings, which is challenging.
We are to some extent, but it changes over time. You know, when the market went down and construction went down, it made a lot more people available who were looking for full-time employment with high skill levels, and we took advantage of that. But then when the market started to recover, we started to lose some of those people, and then we had to outsource. It was the same people doing the work, we were just paying more to have them do it.
I will tell you that anecdotally we do see that. I don't have data to back that up in front of me, but particularly at smaller institutions, you know, everybody has an elevator contractor unless you have enough work to occupy one full time. Roofing contractor, do a periodic inspection for roofs. We're seeing as there are institutions that don't have that full-time need for particular high-tech things, there is a tendency to contract that more and more. So again, I don't have the data, but that is a conversation that we're often involved in at institutions. Great, so the next topic I'd like to bring up is deferred maintenance, which we'll probably spend more time talking on, but I wanted to kind of begin this by framing out the discussion by looking at some numbers that go way back. And what I wanted to do first was bring up a quote. You know, we talked about earlier how space has been growing across the board at institutions across the country, so I wanted to bring up a quote. Essentially says, one side effect of this rapid growth has been the creation of an increasingly large obligation for the future renewal and replacement of physical plant. Does this sound pretty accurate to where you guys are right now? Well, what's interesting to us is that this wasn't written recently at all. This isn't even a year old or 5 years old. This was written 36 years ago by Rick Biedenweg, who's actually the founder of what was called the Pacific Partners Consulting Group. He wrote a white paper called Before the Roof Caves In. We'd love that title. And what Rick was referring to was the age of construction of facilities within colleges and universities. This is my favorite graph, so if you remember one graph, this is the one I want it to be. What Rick did and what we confirmed is, as we aligned all of the space constructed across all of our hundreds of institutions across the country on a very simple axis by construction date, 40% of all space that's in existence today was built in what we call the post-war era. And when Rick wrote his paper in 1980, that wave of construction was approaching its first renewal cycle, about 20, 25 years of age. So a lot of the smaller mechanical items, interior finishes, roofing in some instances becomes due. And what Rick was essentially saying is that we need to be careful because we have a lot of these assets that are coming due at about the same time. Well, construction slowed down and we listened, and that was really the first time as an industry that we started to talk about deferred maintenance in a big way. And then we started building again in what we call the complex era. And we just spoke briefly about high-tech complex spaces. What's interesting is that these buildings that were built during the tech bubble and potentially the mortgage bubble as well will be reaching their 20 to 25-year renewal cycle shortly. At the same time that those post-war facilities are reaching their 50-year of age. And that, as we all know, is when bigger ticket items typically become due for renewal: chillers, boilers, roofs, exteriors. So what we have now, and coming down the road potentially, is a situation where these two groups of spaces will be competing against each other for limited funding. In 1980, when Rick wrote his quote, there were a lot of different things that institutions can do. They could raise tuition, they could increase enrollment, they could ask the state for resources, they could borrow, they could endowment spend. A lot of those same levers aren't available right now. State aid is down across the board almost. We've raised tuition as an industry every year for the past 35 years. Debt capacity is maxed out at a lot of institutions, so the ability to do the things that we did in 1980 is not there. And we see backlogs, as we measure them across our institutions, continually rising. And this is a comprehensive number. It includes maintenance, modernization, and infrastructure. But we are rapidly approaching $100 a square foot on the public side, and we're going to be at 90 on the private side relatively soon. But growth on both sides. Oops. So, dramatic picture. I'm sure we all have a lot of barns on our campuses, but the question is, what have you all done to help make sure that Rick's prediction of the roof caving in does not actually happen? I'll start on the waste side with Mike.
Well, first is I want to say I have a personal mission and a request for everybody. I'm trying to get us all to agree not to use deferred maintenance as the term, because I think that, at least when I talk to legislators and others, it suggests that we're not doing our job and taking care of things on a day-to-day basis. I think a better phrase is deferred renewal, is that we just don't have enough money to replace it when it comes due. You know, the tires, you can replace, take care of your tires and switch them, but at some point they just are done. And I think that's more of what I see, at least when I talk to peers. So what have we done to make that true? Well, we spend a lot of money on roofs, but let everything else fall apart. I think maybe that's what our answer to this picture. I think that 20 years ago, we were doing life cycle modeling to say when are things done. And then our CFO said, well, you just told me this window in this room has no value. I said, well, that's not quite true, because he said, well, see, it's still keeping the wind out. It's fine. So he said, okay, we moved then to more of a facility condition needs assessment and had people actually on place looking at it and saying what is really in need as opposed to just it's old. And so we got big numbers and people sort of agreed with it. And then we got to a sense of it, yep, that's a number. Wow, that is so big. Let's talk about something else. And it just was unactionable. It wasn't specific enough. And so the next thing we've moved into, it's gotten more traction, I think, is take that information and put it in GIS maps. So we can color code, show the campus at a really quick visual what the condition of their campus is by building. So every building has a color based on its condition, and it gives a sense of where the need is and where the gaps are. It's still not quite enough. So we've been pushing the next two things. But with that information, the board has adopted a metric that they've been really the only facility metric they have in their progress card for the university. It tracks how many gross square feet do we have in poor or critical space. And they don't have a target to say we're going to eliminate by a date. We just said that we're going to make it less. So can we all agree we're going to make it less, reduce the amount of square feet in poor and critical space? Meanwhile, to help try to make it more actionable, I don't know if this ever happens to you, but we're thinking about knocking down a building. Meanwhile, the department is thinking about renovating the space. We've been working on and hope to have done this spring what we call a building by building plan, which is really a strategic facility plan. For every building, what's our plan? Is this one going to be what's in good shape, we're going to keep it? Is it in poor shape, but we want to catch it up? Is it in bad shape, but we just want to ride it out until it's done? We're going to keep people safe, and that's about it? Or are we going to actively move to demolish it and get rid of it? And we're not looking just at the physical condition. We're all looking at about 10 different variables. Some architectural. Is it historic? Is it special? Is it flexible and can be renovated? What's its energy use? What's its all these variables. And then with that, we're going to put a label on each one and then be able to communicate to the colleges and departments, this building isn't in our future. We encourage you not to spend money on it, but we're going to work on a plan together with you. So we're hoping this kind of Regent target tied to a very specific building by building action plan will help us be able to use the scarce resources, which aren't enough, in a more targeted, in a more strategic and specific way.
Great. Thank you. You actually mentioned something interesting that we see at a lot of institutions, which is presenting an increasingly large backlog number every year oftentimes has the effect of paralyzing the discussion. So people have had to be a lot more strategic. They've had to frame backlog in a way that ties out to mission, because presenting a bunch of broken roofs every year tends to make people say, well, you know what? You told me that roof was broken last year. It didn't leak, so it's fine. Absolutely right. And what we've had success with is making sure that when you're presenting a big, scary number, that you're able to break that big, scary number into smaller, more manageable numbers that ties to some strategic goal that's institutionally accepted. You know, we've worked with a lot of institutions that have recently adopted strategic plans from the top down that stress things like scientific research or student life. Being able to tie a backlog number or facilities needs into those strategic objectives is oftentimes very helpful in getting money approved year after year. And when you're able to monitor the success of that and show how that investment helped that strategic objective, oftentimes not only do you get the money once, but you get it year after year after year. Very important.
Mike, I think you picked up, you mentioned so many different things that really struck home with me, but one of our big challenges is with the facility condition assessment. The poor buildings, those are always on the radar screen, but our challenge is always to monitor those fair buildings as they start to get into the poor, and then make sure that we're paying attention to those before they do get too far down the road.
We're fortunate the state of Georgia gives us money each year for major repair renewal, which is the term we use, MRR. Last year it was $60 million, and this year it was $60 million. That's in comparison to a capital improvement budget of about $250 million. And then that money is allocated among institutions based on their portfolio, their condition, their needs, and other considerations. And actually, that's probably a Georgia barn, because we just tore down about 200 of those on the University of Georgia campus. That's actually one of the challenges, because there's money often to build new buildings or renovate them or even maintain them, but when the buildings are obsolete, the funding to tear down a building is hard to come by, because for obvious reasons there's very little political interest in that. And but it's important to tear them down when you can, because otherwise then the people try to move back into them and try to reuse them and create yet another problem.
One of the things we've done for the past decade, well, about a decade ago, we created our first 10-year capital plan in the 270 years that the institution has been there. And the trustees insisted that in creating that plan, we budgeted not only the construction, the project costs for building new buildings, but also the lifetime maintenance costs for those buildings. So that's something that has served us well.
That's interesting. Yeah, we've worked with a lot of institutions that have basically created endowments for annual stewardship. They're oftentimes not enough, but they do create some pool of available funding for when renewal needs occur in that space. So that is sort of a best practice that we oftentimes recommend, but it's one that's oftentimes just simply not affordable by many.
Yeah, we've done that at Michigan with gifts for naming and new construction. We've taken a portion of the donor's gift is allocated to a maintenance endowment, and then there's a corresponding university match. And we've been pretty successful with it, but have had to stop the program because of ongoing funding needs. But we have about 10 right now in place that will continue in perpetuity, and that's been it's been really great from an operations perspective, because the goals of the program are to work with the academic user and also develop a spending plan. And so going out and hearing very specific program needs of a museum or an auditorium has been, I think, really good for my team to be more intimately involved with the customer. We had a percentage of the gift, and so we knew that it wouldn't offset all of the needs. 10% of the gift.
In our case, we take 2% of the construction cost and put that into the endowment for each building. It's never exactly right. It should be more than that for a lab. It should be less than that for a residence, but on average, that's what we use. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, we tend to have the group come back about every 5, I think it's been about 5 years. Last time was 7, I think it had been. In between that, we have a group of staff, project coordinators, who act as sort of the owner's rep for facilities between the construction group and the customer, sort of helping identify what's going on, what is the impact of construction, what's facilities' role, so they tend to be our voice in the construction process. We make it their job to update that information based on projects. So they have, we distributed that activity, so it's somebody's job to do it.
That's similar at Michigan. We take a team approach. So we encourage our customers to be monitoring our database and making sure that all of the projects are in there, and then the maintenance staff as well.
It's interesting. One of the things that we hear a lot is that the condition assessment is very important, that it be accurate, that it be properly costed, that the estimates be fair. But at the end of the day, any project that you execute on, you're going to do some engineering work on anyway, anything of any size. You're not going to go directly from a condition assessment to shovel in the ground. So it'd be very important, and almost more important, that that study be structured in a way that gets you funding. Because at the end of the day, if you don't, that sort of just becomes a bunch of binders on the shelf, and you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So the fact that it be updated regularly is important. We typically see 3 to 5 years in rotation, but it's important that you find a way to use that study in a way that drives your agenda forward.
And Jay, we try not to be too specific. We use it as an indicator and a trend.
Good.
So that a dean that has a 0.35 doesn't get too upset.
Numbers are very important.
Right.
Any other questions on capital renewal or deferred renewal, deferred maintenance? Great. I'm going to bring up another trend, and we kind of hinted on this a few minutes ago, but demolition. And this is another conversation that we see happening on campuses more and more. And we've been involved with a number of institutions over the past couple of years that are beginning to remove, the way that we describe it as removal of non-performing assets, softer than demolition. But we used to see this in the context of replacement. Growing program has outgrown a space. We need a new space. There's a tremendous amount of liability in the existing space, so we're going to tear that down. We're going to both remove backlog and enhance the institution. It works. What we're seeing more and more is institutions taking space utilization into account, looking at their backlog, and saying, do we actually need all the space that we currently have? And that's not to say that we consciously want to shrink our institution, but it's saying in the short run, we have a building that is more of a liability than an asset. It's underutilized. It has a very large backlog. Can we live without for a little bit? And we've seen a number of institutions take a relatively courageous step. You know, no president wants to be known as the president that shrunk the campus. But we've worked at several institutions, including the University of Maine, that actually did something interesting, which is a combination of sale of space and tearing down some older non-functioning space. The same conversation we see happening at a number of institutions across the country, more than we've seen it in the past. And we think it's in response to the fact that, you know, the liabilities and the deferral is absolutely there. At the same time, enrollment might not be so steady, and the funding to mitigate the deferral does not exist. So I'd like to open that up to the panel. Is this something that you're hearing at all at your institutions, or what is the conversation like about demolition at your schools?
The hardest thing, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, the hardest thing about demolition often is the historic nature of the facilities. Anything over 50 years old, seems to gather a following, no matter how bad the building might actually be. But we are looking to encourage our institutions to actually consider demolition more and more as a viable option. Because again, the longer it sits there, it takes money. You can't just leave it. They often attract unwanted attention and activities inside the buildings if they're not maintained. And so we are looking to try to encourage more demolition in our institutions.
We've done a fair amount of demolition, but always with replacement. The one wave of demolition that we've gone through without replacement wasn't necessarily because the buildings were in bad shape. It was because of the evolution of technology. We had a lot of research going on in a long track, a particle accelerator. We had an airplane hangar and an airfield where people were doing their experiments. They can now all do that on a computer. So we tore down all those buildings and built a data center, and it's a much more efficient from their perspective and from ours, way to do the research.
I think we've done some. The problem is we tend to be knocking down 20,000 square foot buildings and building 150,000 square foot buildings. So the math isn't working always in our equation. We do have some on, I think you're right, the technology shift is the problem because we try to renovate things, but old buildings are better for renovations for offices. But it's hard to renovate those really old hospitals for a new research building. So our target is, some people, we have a particular building called the Mayo Building, which we have, instead of a Mayo or bust, it's Bust Mayo project. So we're hoping to get to that, which is almost 900,000 square feet. But it's going to take a lot of dominoes and some partial replacements to do it.
Great, thanks. It's going to bring us to our last topic, and that is sustainability. Sustainability really came into the conversation in higher ed in a really prominent way before the recession. And we've been involved with it ever since the launch of the President's Climate Commitment. We added a lot of environmental metrics, environmental benchmarks to our annual offering, and we were able to really release a lot of good, verified information to the world that helped kind of guide the conversation. We released a paper this past year called, much like we have the state of facilities, we call this the state of sustainability. This is in conjunction with the University of New Hampshire. I was a little bit disappointed. I'll tell a little personal failure of mine, which was I was growing up, Kermit the Frog was kind of my guy. I really like Kermit. Embarrassing, but I'll totally throw it out there. But I really wanted to name this It's Not Easy Being Green. And I thought I was going to go into the marketing meeting and I was going to bring up this great idea and everyone's mind will be blown. And the paper is not called It's Not Easy Being Green. I didn't win it all. But what we did was assemble a lot of our core data on sustainability, environmental metrics in one place. Some very interesting things. I'm going to go in general, talk about one, and that is we absolutely have seen emissions when we're talking about scope 1 and 2, and those are really utilities across the institutions, go down. We've gone down by about 5% as an industry. What is interesting is that at the same time, consumption has gone up. And that is because of new buildings. It's because energy is cheap. And the gains that have been made have largely been made on fuel switching, which is important. People are moving from coal. Some large institutions adopting natural gas, replacing older plants. We're moving from oil to natural gas. We're even beginning to move from natural gas to a lot of renewables in a lot of regions across the country. But we're using more of it. So a lot of findings here. This is a slide taken directly from a talk that I gave a few weeks back. But I wanted to hone in on one of the key points from the bottom, which is being successful at sustainability on your campus means institutional commitment from the top and from the bottom. If you have alignment from students all the way up to the president and to the board, those are the institutions that generally, walk the walk when it comes to being green. So with that in mind, I'd like to open up to the panel and say, what have you seen at your institutions have been the keys to being successful when it comes to the green movement?
I would say it's just exactly the factors that you mentioned, Jay. We're fortunate that the current president and the president before did not need to be convinced that climate change was an issue. But part of the reason for that is because a lot of our faculty, I'm just guessing, maybe 20%, are either climate scientists or climate policy people. So this is a conversation that takes place every day around coffee or around lunches and things like that. And at the same time, we seem to attract a fair number of students who come predisposed to worry about these things and then get engaged once they're on campus.
Interesting. Yep.
Most of that sustainability effort takes place at the individual campus level. It's not, we have a board policy on sustainability, but for the most part, it's delegated to the campus. Most of our efforts are more economically oriented on reducing energy costs and things like that. We have switched, as you say, from some fuels. University of Georgia, we just swapped out a large coal boiler for an electric boiler, and that in itself has helped reduce, some of the pollution issues that we've dealt with.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this last night. A big challenge with sustainability is you can only make so much progress, and then it starts costing a lot of money. And the balance between the institutional commitment versus how much resources you want to spend is big. So at Michigan now, we have a central power plant that's fueled with natural gas, and we're looking at a project to add capacity to that. But even with that, that will only get us half the way to our goal, a long-term goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so we need something else big that also will cost money. And so those conversations, I think, have been really kind of eye-opening with institutional leadership.
I think you're right. The faculty and students are driving it from the social and value perspective. The board and leadership is much more driven by the economics. And so when you can combine the two, it works well. Someday when we get to more of the conflict, I think there'll be much more of a challenge. One of the ways to help guide us through this is we built a climate action plan for us. We knew there were lots of, everyone had their pet idea, whether they were a wind person or a solar person or whatever they were. So we took all the different ideas that could help establish that goal and put a cost per ton of carbon reduced. So the evaluation we say is, do we all agree that we should do the cheapest thing first? And it's hard to argue with that in general until it comes out that the cheapest thing is always about reducing energy consumption, switching out to LED lights, all the building retro stuff, which isn't what a lot of people want to see. I really want to have a solar thing on campus? And I can say, well, compared to this, which is the best answer? Not that we haven't had to do a little one here or there, so we have something to point to. But that has been a metric and a tool that we've been able to use internally and externally.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at the time. We have about 3 minutes left. So with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions from the audience about anything that you've heard today in the time we have remaining. All right, well, I'm going to leave you with a few extra minutes to move between rooms. So I thank you all. I thank the panel up here and hope to be speaking with all you over the coming days.